You won't believe what happened when our power-hungry HOA president decided to bulldoze my disabled sister's wheelchair ramp while she was away at work. But what this entitled neighbor didn't realize was that my sister wasn't just any resident. She was the state governor. And this was about to become the biggest mistake of Karen Whitmore's HOA career. But how did one petty act of revenge turn into a national scandal? Stay with me, because this story is about to get wild. Welcome to my channel. If you love HOA horror stories and tales about entitled Karens, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because today's story is one for the history books. It all started with a bright yellow violation notice slapped onto our front door. The moment I saw it, my blood boiled. The 5th notice this month, all because of my sister Madeline's wheelchair ramp. I crumpled the paper and tossed it onto the ever-growing pile of Karen Whitmore's official warnings, just as I heard the familiar hum of Madeline's electric wheelchair rolling up behind me. "Another love letter from our wonderful neighbor?" she asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. The dark circles under her eyes were hard to miss. Between her demanding job and months of physical therapy after her accident, she was running on fumes. But even with all of that, she never complained. Not about work, not about the accident that put her in the wheelchair 6 months ago, and certainly not about Karen's constant harassment. "You'd think being HOA president would keep her busy enough without stalking our house," I muttered, glancing through the kitchen window. And there she was, Karen Whitmore, standing in her driveway, phone in hand, snapping pictures of our ramp like it was a crime scene. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection, and her designer workout outfit screamed, "I have nothing better to do than micromanage other people's lives." But the real giveaway? That unmistakable look of pure spite on her face. I remember the day we installed the ramp like it was yesterday. We followed every rule in the book, hired a licensed contractor, got the proper city permits, even painted it the exact shade of gray to match our house trim. But before the concrete was even dry, Karen was already waving the HOA rulebook like it was a sacred text, barking out nonsense about community standards and property values. Section 8, paragraph 3 clearly states that all external modifications must be approved by the board, she had said in that overly sweet but condescending tone. What really got under my skin wasn't just that she objected to the ramp. It was the fact that she kept scheduling HOA meetings to discuss it at times when Madeline couldn't attend. Not that my sister could have gone anyway. She was too busy running the entire state. That's right. My sister wasn't just another homeowner. She was the governor of North Carolina. But we had kept that quiet, hoping for some privacy during her recovery. Karen had no idea who she was messing with, and soon she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of faint murmuring outside. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I pulled back the curtains, and my stomach dropped. Karen Whitmore stood across the street in her neatly pressed red blazer, flanked by 2 men in dark suits. They were pointing at our ramp, gesturing dramatically as one of them scribbled notes into a thick leather notebook. The other had a camera in hand, snapping pictures like our home was some kind of crime scene. I didn't like this. I stepped outside just in time to see Karen handing them thick manila envelopes, her face smug with satisfaction. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. I turned to my sister, Madeline Carter, who was settling into the driver's seat of her car for her morning physical therapy appointment. "I don't like this," I muttered. "Maybe it's time we let them know who they're really dealing with." Madeline shook her head, her expression firm. "I won't use my position to get special treatment. We'll handle this the right way, through proper channels." I wanted to believe that, I really did. But the way Karen's smile stretched wider as she spoke to those men made my gut churn. The last time she had looked this pleased, we had received 3 HOA violation notices in 1 week. Something told me this wasn't over. I pulled out my phone, activating the camera just as Karen's voice carried across the yard, clear and triumphant. "Yes, we'll need that bulldozer here first thing tomorrow morning. The board has already approved the removal." My heart stopped. Bulldozer? They were actually planning to tear down Madeline's wheelchair ramp? As Madeline's car disappeared down the road, I rushed back inside, my hands shaking with fury. My first instinct was to check our security cameras. Sure enough, the footage from last week showed Karen standing outside measuring the ramp with a tape measure at 6 o'clock a.m., like some kind of HOA assassin. That's when I knew I had to start documenting everything. I grabbed a thick folder filled with copies of our permits, approval documents, and even city ordinances proving that our ramp was completely legal. But even as I flipped through the paperwork, I knew that Karen didn't care about the law. She cared about control. By the time the sun set that evening, I had gathered every notice, letter, and recorded conversation. I even dug through public HOA records, looking for anything I could use against her. That's when I found something interesting, something that might finally put an end to her reign of terror. The problem was, I just wasn't sure if I'd be able to use it before it was too late. Tomorrow morning, a bulldozer was set to arrive, and if Karen thought she could destroy our ramp without consequences, she was in for a rude awakening. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could hear was the roar of a bulldozer engine, the crunch of metal against concrete, and the smug laughter of Karen Whitmore. I kept checking our security cameras, half expecting to see her outside measuring the ramp again, just to make sure it would fit under the blade. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of permits, legal documents, and city ordinances spread out in front of me. This was my ammo. If Karen thought she could tear down our wheelchair ramp without a fight, she was dead wrong. Then it happened. A low, rumbling noise rolled through the neighborhood, rattling the dishes in the sink. My spoon clattered against the bowl as I jumped up and ran to the window. My heart nearly stopped. Sitting right in the middle of our driveway was a bright yellow bulldozer, its metal blade gleaming in the early morning sun. Two construction workers in orange vests were standing next to it, one of them stretching a yellow measuring tape across the ramp while the other jotted something down in a clipboard. And there, standing front and center, basking in the destruction she was about to cause, was Karen Whitmore. Her red blazer was immaculate, her blonde hair styled to perfection, and in her arms she clutched a thick stack of documents, as if they were holy commandments handed down by the HOA gods themselves. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and stormed outside. "What do you think you're doing?" My voice came out shakier than I wanted it to be, but I planted my feet firmly on the ground, determined not to back down. Karen's face lit up with her usual fake smile, the one she used at HOA meetings when she wanted to sound reasonable while ruining someone's life. "Oh good, you're home," she chirped, strutting toward me in her designer heels, which immediately sank into our freshly watered grass. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to smile. "I have here an emergency order from the HOA board," she declared, waving a sheet of paper in my face before yanking it back before I could snatch it. "This structure is in direct violation of community guidelines. Section 4.23. I took a deep breath, just like Madeline had taught me during her campaign speeches. "Stay calm, stay in control, don't let them see you panic." "Karen," I said, my voice level but firm, "we both know this isn't about guidelines, it's about power. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Because what Karen didn't know was that I had uncovered something last night, something big, and she was about to find out just how badly she had messed up. Karen, we submitted all the proper paperwork. We have approval from the city," I said, holding up my phone, ready to pull up the official documents. Karen Whitmore didn't even blink. Instead, she gave me that fake, syrupy smile that made my skin crawl. "The city isn't the HOA, dear." Her voice was sickeningly sweet, dripping with condescension. "And as president of the board, it's my duty to maintain our community standards. This ramp is an eyesore. It's bringing down property values. Just look at how it clashes with the neighborhood aesthetic." Behind her, the bulldozer revved its engine, the loud mechanical roar cutting through the morning air. My stomach dropped. I pulled up the property maps Madeline had saved for me, the permits, the city approval, everything proving that our ramp was 100% legal. "This is illegal," I said, my voice sharper now. "You can't just demolish someone's property without proper notice or a court order." Karen just laughed, a high-pitched grating sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Notice was given 3 weeks ago," she said, smugly pulling a document from her stack. "Certified mail. We have the receipt right here." I snatched the paper from her hand, scanning it quickly. My jaw clenched. The signature wasn't ours. Someone had faked it. I felt a surge of panic. Frantically, I dialed Madeline's number. Straight to voicemail. Of course, she was in a closed-door budget meeting today. I tried her assistant. No answer. I called her security team. Nothing. Meanwhile, the construction workers had begun placing orange cones around our driveway. But something was off. One of the workers kept checking his paperwork, whispering to his colleague. He was pointing at something on the forms, clearly uneasy. I stepped forward, planting myself between the bulldozer and the ramp. "If you do this," I warned, my voice rising, "you'll be hearing from our lawyers. This is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act." I lifted my phone, hitting the live stream button. If they were going to break the law, the entire world was going to watch. For the first time, Karen's smile faltered. "The HOA is exempt from— No HOA is exempt from federal law," I shouted, my voice carrying through the quiet streets. A light flicked on in the house across the street. Then another. I caught movement from the corner of my eye, Mr. Alvarado, our elderly neighbor, poking his head out of his front door. The second he saw Karen standing next to a running bulldozer, he disappeared back inside. Something told me he wasn't going back to bed. Karen Whitmore turned to the bulldozer operator, her perfectly manicured hand giving a sharp, decisive nod. The machine roared to life, its massive treads grinding into our driveway. A thick cloud of dust and exhaust filled the air as the blade lowered toward the ramp, the same ramp that had taken us weeks to install, with every permit in place, every rule followed. I gripped my phone tightly, my hands trembling, but my voice was steady. "Last chance, Karen. You're making a huge mistake." She turned to me, her icy blue eyes devoid of any remorse, that fake, polished smile still plastered on her face. "The only mistake," she said, voice dripping with smug satisfaction, "was allowing this monstrosity to be built in the first place. Sometimes people need to learn that rules exist for a reason." Then, with a sickening screech of metal against concrete, the bulldozer blade made contact with the ramp. I watched in horror as chunks of carefully constructed concrete broke apart, tumbling onto our driveway like discarded rubble. Weeks of effort, thousands of dollars, and the only way my sister Madeline could safely access her home, gone in seconds. But Karen had made a miscalculation. While she basked in her victory, reveling in the destruction like a conductor leading an orchestra of chaos, she didn't notice what was happening behind her. Our neighbor, Mr. Alvarado, had returned, and this time he wasn't just watching, he was recording, and he wasn't alone. One by one, neighbors emerged from their homes, phones raised, capturing every second of Karen's reckless abuse of power. Some whispered in disbelief, others muttered angrily under their breath. Even the construction workers looked uneasy, one of them stepping back, clearly realizing they were part of something that felt very, very wrong. Then my phone buzzed in my hand, a text from Madeline's head of security. "Stay calm, keep recording, help is 3 minutes out." For the first time that morning, I smiled. Karen was so absorbed in her moment of triumph, so sure of her absolute control, that she failed to notice the distant sound of sirens growing louder. She didn't see the black SUVs turning onto our street, their tinted windows gleaming under the morning sun. She didn't notice the red and blue lights flickering in the distance, cutting through the peaceful quiet of our suburban neighborhood. She didn't realize her perfect little HOA dictatorship was about to collapse right in front of her. And by the time she did, it was already too late. My hands were shaking, but I kept my phone steady, recording every second of what was about to unfold. Karen Whitmore stood tall, her smug satisfaction unwavering. At least until she heard the first screech of tires. Her smile flickered. Then came another, and another. 3 state police cruisers pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing across the houses, followed by 5 identical black SUVs, government vehicles, sleek and unmistakable. The neighbors who had been peeking cautiously through their curtains suddenly spilled onto their front lawns, whispering among themselves. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. Karen's confidence cracked. "What is all this?" she demanded, her voice a little higher than before. "This is a private neighborhood matter." Before she could say another word, the back door of the center SUV swung open. A team of security personnel stepped out first, scanning the area with trained precision. Then, the moment that froze the entire street, Madeline Carter rolled out, wearing her official governor's blazer. The silence was deafening. I had only seen that stern, commanding expression on my sister's face during major press conferences. But today it was directed right at Karen. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore," Madeline's voice rang out, clear and authoritative. This became a state matter the moment you violated federal disability protection laws. Karen visibly swallowed, stepping back, her fingers tightening around her stack of violation notices like they could somehow protect her. Madeline wheeled forward, her security team moving in perfect formation around her. Not to mention, she continued, destroying state property without authorization. Karen's face went through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds, none of them good. State property? She squeaked. Yes, Madeline said coolly, pulling out her phone. Would you like to see the deed, or should we discuss the Americans with Disabilities Act first? I'm particularly familiar with Title II, having just signed new state protections last month. The crowd grew larger, people pressing forward, whispering. More phones were out now. Across the street, Mrs. Carter was already live on Facebook. Karen backed away, clutching her precious HOA rulebook to her chest like it was some sort of holy artifact. But the HOA bylaws clearly state, she started, her voice trembling. Madeline cut her off with a smirk. Interesting, you should mention those, she said. Karen had no idea just how much trouble she was in. Madeline Carter didn't even blink as Karen Whitmore stammered, her grip on the HOA rulebook tightening like it could somehow shield her from reality. With a simple motion, Madeline gestured to her assistant, who stepped forward holding a thick binder, the pages neatly tabbed and marked. My legal team has been reviewing your HOA's bylaws all afternoon, Madeline said, her voice even and controlled. Would you like to know what we found? Karen didn't answer, but the members of her HOA board did, by quietly backing away from her. A few tried to slip into the crowd, but it was too late. Smart move, I thought. Madeline let the silence hang in the air before continuing. Multiple violations of state housing laws. The crowd shifted uneasily. Discriminatory practices. Karen visibly paled. Madeline paused for effect, then delivered the final blow. And irregular financial records going back 3 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I kept my camera trained on Karen's face, watching it turn whiter than the violation notices she loved handing out. I didn't know, Karen sputtered, her voice cracking. Madeline arched an eyebrow. That I was the governor? She finished for her. Or that bulldozing a disabled person's access ramp without proper notice or permits is a federal offense. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then, 2 state investigators stepped forward, notebooks in hand. Behind them, news vans were already pulling up at the end of the street. One of the investigators cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, we'll need you to come with us to answer some questions about today's events. He glanced down at the binder. And these financial discrepancies. Karen froze, clutching her beloved rulebook like it was a lifeline. But it was over. As she was led away, still mumbling about property values and HOA bylaws, Madeline turned to face the gathered crowd. She didn't need a podium, a microphone, or a campaign stage. Sitting in her wheelchair, surrounded by the rubble of what had once been her access to her own home, she looked every bit the leader she was. My fellow neighbors, she began, her voice steady, today we have an opportunity to discuss what community really means. She gestured toward the destroyed ramp. This isn't just about me or my access to my home. This is about every person's right to live with dignity in their own community. The crowd was silent, but the weight of her words hung in the air. I scanned their faces, shame, anger, realization. But more than anything, understanding. And as I watched Karen being loaded into a police car, still clutching her precious HOA rulebook, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen to our peaceful neighborhood now? The morning after the bulldozing incident, I woke up to the relentless buzzing of my phone. At first, I thought it was just a few texts from concerned neighbors. But when I glanced at the screen, my heart nearly stopped. Our security camera footage had gone viral overnight. The video of Karen Whitmore ordering the destruction of a wheelchair ramp had exploded across social media, racking up hundreds of thousands of views in mere hours. By the time I pulled open the blinds, news vans were already lined up outside our house, their reporters swarming the sidewalk like vultures circling a fresh kill. But that wasn't even the craziest part. An old high school friend of mine, now a civil rights lawyer, had sent me an email with shocking information about Karen's past. I clicked the attached files, and what I found made my blood run cold. Karen had been sued 3 times before for similar abuses of power. 3 different neighborhoods, 3 separate HOAs. Each time she had managed to settle quietly, sweeping the lawsuits under the rug and moving on to terrorize a new community. But this time, she had picked the wrong house on the wrong day. And Madeline Carter, being the governor of North Carolina, wasn't about to let this slide. Instead of just getting mad, she got organized. That very afternoon, Madeline called an emergency press conference right on our front lawn. The shattered remains of her wheelchair ramp still lay in the driveway behind her, a powerful visual reminder of what had happened. The reporters went wild when she stepped up to speak, and then she dropped the bombshell. 17 separate violations of state housing regulations, multiple breaches of federal disability laws. Karen wasn't just guilty of overreach. She had been breaking laws for years. But here's where things got even more interesting. One by one, our elderly neighbors began to step forward. Mrs. Patel revealed how Karen had forced her to tear out her medical herb garden, claiming it was an eyesore. Mr. Alvarado produced documents proving Karen had fined him for installing a wheelchair lift for his disabled father. Even the Quiet Lawson family shared how Karen had threatened them with HOA fines for their autistic son's sensory-friendly playground equipment. The neighborhood I had known for years suddenly felt different. People weren't just whispering behind closed doors anymore. They were talking, they were sharing stories, and most importantly, they were standing together. Karen Whitmore wasn't done fighting. Despite everything, the federal violations, the financial discrepancies, and the growing outrage in the community, she still thought she could control the narrative. She called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called unfounded accusations, hoping to rally her supporters. But when she arrived at the community center, only 2 people showed up, her most loyal followers from the board, both of whom looked uneasy sitting beside her. The rest of the neighborhood? They were at our house. Madeline had invited disability rights advocates, state officials, and legal experts to host an educational session on accessible housing rights. Half the community showed up, eager to learn how they could prevent another Karen situation from happening ever again. And then things took an even wilder turn. Someone leaked Karen's financial records to the press. The truth? She had been using HOA fines to pay for her own home renovations, disguising them as board-approved community improvements. The fallout was immediate. The HOA's lawyer resigned on the spot. 3 board members quit through angry emails that somehow ended up in the hands of the local news. By now, Karen's entire house of cards was falling apart, but she still refused to go down without a fight. The next morning, she stormed onto our property, holding a cease and desist letter, her face red with anger. "You need to stop spreading lies about me," she snapped, waving the papers in front of me. But she had made a grave miscalculation. Because at that exact moment, she walked right into a meeting between Madeline and the state housing commissioner, who had been very interested in reviewing every HOA decision Karen had made over the last 5 years. Karen froze, her eyes darting between the officials and the documents on the table. The realization hit her all at once. This wasn't just about a wheelchair ramp anymore. This was the end. That evening, as the news helicopters circled overhead, neighbors began placing support accessible housing signs in their yards. One by one they went up until Karen's house stood alone without one. By sunset, our story had made national headlines. And just when we thought it couldn't get any bigger, Madeline received a new set of documents. Documents tying Karen's personal contracting business to the bulldozing company. The next morning, she wouldn't be coming back as HOA president. The morning after Karen's downfall, I woke up to hundreds of messages from neighbors sharing their own HOA horror stories. My phone buzzed nonstop. News reporters wanted interviews. Advocacy groups reached out, and the internet was ablaze with discussions about corrupt HOAs. But one message stood out. It was from Mrs. Alvarado, our elderly neighbor. Karen had fined her last month for having a garden gnome on her front lawn, claiming it was a violation of community standards. But Mrs. Alvarado had proof that Karen had been breaking HOA laws herself. I printed out every HOA rule and spent the entire day highlighting the violations Karen had ignored. Then we found the biggest bombshell yet. Madeline's legal team discovered that Karen had never even filed the proper paperwork to become HOA president. She had simply taken over when the previous president moved away, and no one dared to question her. The deeper we dug, the more corruption we uncovered. Then something incredible happened. Our story reached Tommy Chen, a famous YouTube lawyer known for exposing HOA corruption. He flew in to meet with Madeline, offering to help us sue Karen and the HOA for free. His video about our case went viral overnight, racking up millions of views in just one day. Karen, desperate to salvage her reputation, called for one last emergency HOA meeting. But this time, things were different. Instead of an empty room with 2 loyal board members, the community center was packed. People who had never spoken up before finally had the courage to share their stories. Mr. Jenkins held up pictures of his daughter's treehouse that Karen had forced him to tear down. The Wilson family recounted how Karen had fined them for their Christmas lights, claiming they were too bright and disrupting the neighborhood aesthetic. Then Madeline took the stage. She didn't just talk about the ramp, she unveiled her new law, the Right to Home Happiness Act, a law designed to protect homeowners from abusive HOAs. The room erupted in cheers, and then came the final blow. Our security camera footage revealed that Karen had lied on official HOA documents about receiving permission to bulldoze the ramp. It wasn't just corruption anymore, it was fraud. Karen Whitmore's downfall was swift and absolute. When her own lawyer dropped her case, she had no choice but to cut her losses and run. 2 days later, we stood on our front porch, watching Karen pack up her precious row of neatly trimmed bushes, the same ones she had forced everyone else in the neighborhood to copy. With her HOA empire in ruins, she had no power left. As her moving truck disappeared down the street, no one waved goodbye. But what happened next? That's the real story. With Karen gone, the HOA underwent a total transformation. The new board, made up of actual community members who cared, turned the old violations office into a community help center. Instead of sending out fines, they started delivering welcome baskets to new neighbors. Instead of dictating ridiculous rules, they set up a program to help elderly residents with home repairs. In Madeline's ramp, it got rebuilt, but even better than before. Local artists came together to paint beautiful floral designs along the sides, and at night, soft LED lights made it glow with warmth and color. The neighborhood kids actually thought it was the coolest thing on the street. Last week, Madeline hosted a barbecue in our backyard, the same backyard where Karen once stood screaming about grass height violations. Instead of HOA threats, there was laughter, good food, and neighbors actually enjoying each other's company. And that's when it hit me. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. Even the bulldozer company that had demolished the ramp had a change of heart. Their CEO personally apologized to Madeline and announced that they would now offer free ramp installations to disabled residents across the state. They even launched a scholarship fund for students studying disability rights law. And the biggest surprise? Yesterday, I got promoted to run the state's new homeowner protection office. My first job, teaching other communities how to prevent their HOAs from turning into tyrannies. Madeline says we're just getting started. And you know what? Looking at how much has changed in just 1 year, I believe her. Our story even made it into school textbooks as an example of standing up to unfair rules. But the real victory? It isn't in the headlines or the new laws. It's in the little things, like seeing Mrs. Alvarado's garden gnome collection grow every week, or watching kids play freely on their front lawns without fear of HOA violations. As for Karen's old house, a new family moved in last month. They put up a wheelchair ramp for their grandmother, and this time, no one complained. The story of Karen Whitmore and her abusive HOA reign teaches us a powerful lesson about the importance of standing up against corruption and injustice, no matter how small it may seem. For years, Karen operated unchecked, enforcing ridiculous rules, targeting vulnerable residents, and using her position for personal gain. Many people felt powerless to fight back, believing that HOA regulations were absolute. But when she went too far by demolishing Madeline's wheelchair ramp, her unchecked authority was finally exposed. This story highlights that change happens when people unite. At first, our neighbors felt isolated in their struggles, but once they started sharing their experiences, they realized they were not alone. By coming together, they dismantled a system of abuse and replaced it with one that prioritized community over control. It proves that even in the face of bullying and corruption, standing firm, documenting injustices, and seeking legal and public support can turn the tide. Another key takeaway is the impact of accountability. Karen thrived on fear and silence, but the moment her actions were exposed, through social media, legal action, and community awareness. Her empire collapsed overnight. This reminds us that power without responsibility leads to downfall, and those who abuse their positions will eventually face the consequences. Ultimately, this story is about resilience, justice, and the ability to transform adversity into positive change. The ramp wasn't just rebuilt, it became a symbol of victory, proving that one small act of defiance can spark a movement. When people stand together for what is right, they don't just change their neighborhood, they change lives.